Hello everybody, and the chess master game that I'm going to show you in this video was played in Dresden 1926 between Alekhine and Bluemich. Alekhine was white and he played d4, move 1, knight f6, then knight f3. So Alekhine here is doing an interesting move. The usual move is pawn to c4, where black has a number of options. One of my own pet lines, the Budapest, is available. The Queen's Indian can be played. The Nimzo Indian, the Queen's Gambit declined, or the Catalan. There are lots and lots of options. The Slav is another one. But knight f3 avoids a lot of the main lines, so this will be a more interesting match, which will often be decided by a player's own resourcefulness. So black played g6, aiming to fianchetto the bishop on the long dark square diagonal. And now bishop g5. It is seen at club level and also at higher levels and lower levels, but it has become somewhat of a rarity. It's called the Torre attack, and one of the ideas is to try and double black's pawns by taking the knight. Black can also choose to play knight e4 when the white bishop is attacked, and it usually drops back to f4, and then white is aiming to gain time by attacking the knight with the pawn on f3, or by attacking it in some other way. And it can lead to very tricky opening move orders, where each side is trying to subtly maneuver to reach a more favourable position. However, in this game, that was not done. Instead, black played bishop g7. Now, knight b to d2. So for me, this would signal that white is planning on creating the strong pawn triangle, like in the Col. So the reason you would normally play knight b d2 is that c3 is going to be occupied by a white pawn. So white is going to plan to play c3, and then almost always will plan to play e3 to create the pawn triangle and put the f1 bishop onto d3. So it's a slow building up opening that will allow white to have a slight advantage, but it is not too active. It can just very, very slowly and gradually improve your position rather than going all out too early in the game. Black castled, and now e3 was played. Black is trying for simple development here, castling, fianchettoing, and now plays d6. So this is similar to a King's Indian line. Bishop c4 was now played, and this move did surprise me when I first looked at this game. It's perfectly logical, and it's another reason why white has not played pawn c4. It's to allow the bishop to go to c4, and perhaps later drop back to the b3 square so it aims at the black king. So it's an interesting line, playing bishop c4. It's not the most common move, but it does have some merit to it. I would, though, think that if the bishop did drop back to b3, then if white does the usual plan of playing c3, then there are a few weak light squares in the white camp, particularly d3 might be a weak square where black could try and put a piece there, or just control that square and cramp white's position. But black played knight c6, so he's getting on with developing the knight. This is a very common position for black to have in a King's Indian setup. One of the merits of the King's Indian type setup is that almost no matter what your opponent does, you can pretty much have this position as shown now on the chessboard without being that much worse. Really, you've just got your position, and now you're going to try and do something with it. C3, and now A6. So this move is also seen in the King's Indian. One of the ideas could be to play B5 and gain some space on the queen side. I've sometimes seen moves like bishop B7 be played, trying to fianchetto both bishops. Also, the move B4 could be played, trying to open up the B file and then play rook B8. So black there would try and gain space on the queen side. But after queen e2, black instead pins the white knight on f3. And one of the features of the King's Indian is that if black gets in an early f5, which here is impossible because of the knight on f6 and the white bishop on c4 is pinning the f7 pawn, if black can get in f5 and e5 quite early, the bishop usually stays at home on c8, and in the sort of King's Indian Dutch, it could be very useful later on in perhaps sacrificing itself or being involved in an attack on the king's side. But in some King's Indian lines, black is more than willing to give up the light squared bishop, and that way more easily maneuver the pieces around and not get tangled up, because the fewer minor pieces you have, the easier it is to move them around if you have less space. If you have very little space and you have all four minor pieces, there's usually at least one or two of them which will have a very unpleasant time. Whereas white has a lot more space here and can afford to keep all four minor pieces on the board, where each of them can find something useful to do. So white kicks the bishop, and black now does not take on f3. He instead plays bishop d7, which I don't really like in this position. Feels like white has just got in the move h3 for free, and perhaps white could even try doing a pawn storm, whereas black's bishop on d7 is actually harming the position because it can't go to b7, so the idea of playing b5 and bishop b7 is taken away. And also, the bishop on g7 really wants to spread its wings. And a very common idea is to play knight on f6 to d7, and then either put it on the queen side with knight b6, or play e5, and then both the knight and the bishop are supporting the e5 pawn. So perhaps a better move was bishop to c8. An undeveloping move and looking rather silly, but I think it's better than bishop d7. And now Alekhine plays the odd move knight h2, which I would not have played here. I think I would have castled on the king's side as white. But there is an idea behind knight h2. Whenever you see an odd maneuver like this, which in my mind it goes against opening principles, and I think it's still the opening because white has not castled yet, try and search for a reason why a strong player like Alekhine might have done that, because he's not doing it for no reason. And what move is now possible that was not available to white before? Well, the move is f4. White is indeed planning a pawn storm, and he's thinking of playing f4, perhaps then castling, and then putting the knight back on f3. then possibly playing g4 and trying to advance all his kingside pawns. However, I think this move is a little bit short-sighted. It doesn't really take into account black's idea as well. In the game, black played a rather inferior move, but I would have played e5, which is very common to the King's Indian. It does put myself in a pin. The bishop on g5 is now pinning my knight, but I am threatening to open up the e-file and play rook e8, pinning the white queen to the king. So I think then the best move for white would be to castle. Now I take, and c takes is clearly good, because you're capturing towards the centre. But now playing the move f4 doesn't look so good, because there are now no more pawn captures. The central pawn tension, as it's called, has been resolved. And if white played f4, then the e3 pawn would be backwards, and it would be very weak and susceptible to an attack by black playing rook e8. So here, after rook e8, white's best option may be to play knight on h2 back to f3, and black has succeeded in making white's knight look rather silly, because it's just moved back and forth and not really gained anything. So here, I still think white has not a bad position, but black's life is made a little easier by white's loss of the tempi. So if we go back, black played queen c8, which is vaguely aiming at sacrificing on h3. But I don't like this move, because how is black ever going to successfully sacrifice anything on h3? White's queen and both knights are over on the king side and ready to defend against any sort of attack. So any sacrifice, I don't think, would be very successful. White now has the time to play f4, and here black plays my suggested move a little too late. A better option would be b5. Then after bishop d3 or b3, perhaps rook e8 could be played, aiming to play e5 with the rook already behind the pawn and supporting it. But black actually lunges in the centre immediately, and now white can play f takes, black captures back, and here he can castle, and he's gained a bit of time because the f6 knight is now under attack. And the knight h2 move is now looking very useful. The f file is open, and the knight could even come to g4 in a few moves. So I really like white's position here, but only because black has not played it correctly. He played knight h5, so Alekhine's opponent, Bluemich, is aiming to play knight g3, going for a rather simple cheapo, a fork on the queen and rook. And there's a few good moves for white. The computer doesn't really like Alekhine's move until you play out a few moves, and then it starts to see that it's a lot better than the original evaluation. The move is rook takes f7. And it makes sense because the black queen side isn't very developed. The queen and rook are rather stuck over there. The knight is on the edge of the board on h5. Knights on the rim are dim, is the rhyme to help you remember, where it doesn't have a lot of mobility, and it's not very useful in attacking or defending. And after black is pretty much forced into recapturing, white can force the enemy king to go for a walk. So here, after queen c4 check, black needs to stop the king from being kicked around. So bishop e6 is the correct move, and white wins back the piece with d5. But after bishop takes d5, and the move I would play would be queen takes d5, which is quite logical. Black does have queen e6, rook f1 check, bishop f6, queen f3, and now the bishop is pinned, and white can just keep on attacking the unfortunate bishop. King g7 and knight e4. So here white's going to have a very strong attack along the f file. Bishop takes bishop, knight takes bishop, and perhaps after a move like queen g4, black is in a little bit of trouble. There's a few difficulties to solve, and white is doing better. It's not completely won, but I would definitely prefer white after rook f7 check, king g8, queen e6. And black has to play incredibly carefully to even survive a few moves. But Alekhine did not play this in the game. I would definitely have done it because it looks very convincing. Instead, he played rook to f1 check first. And he did win this game, as you could probably tell by the fact that white has all his pieces aiming at the black monarch. But perhaps he may not have won if his opponent had had the temerity to make his king advance even further up the board. King e6, defending the bishop, and the computer gives this as almost dead even. And I do trust the computer when it comes to tactics of this nature. Queen g4, king d6, knight c4 check, and black is now going to try and swap all the pieces to prevent white having a macing attack. And it does constantly look like white is about to break through, but it seems that black has just about enough to survive, and he does give up the piece, so it's now relatively even here. It's actually completely even on material, and it gives this as being almost exactly equal. I think it's 0.01. So yeah, as equal as it can be, really. And this could have been a very interesting middle game here, with white having a slight weakness of the isolated queen's pawn, but black's king still being a little weak on now having transferred over to the queen side. So going back, this position is one that doesn't look very natural to play king e6, but I think it was black's best practical chance. Instead, he played knight to f6, allowing white to immediately win the piece back. And a similar idea to before occurs here. The queen blocks the check, and now Alekhine goes after the pinned piece with queen f3. So white has 3 attackers on the knight, and black has 3 defenders. But white does have moves such as knight to e4 and knight to g4, both adding another attacker to the f6 knight. The move I would have played as black is h5, but then after knight e4, rook f8, knight takes, bishop takes, queen takes, rook takes. Now white goes a piece up, and this would be a fairly easy endgame for Alekhine to win. Being a bishop up is pretty devastating. So my move of h5 is not very good, but the move played isn't much better. Queen f5, and now there is a winning tactic, which Alekhine found and forced resignation here. It's what is sometimes called an X-ray attack. Bishop takes f6. So the idea here is that the bishop on f6 is actually being defended by the queen and rook, because if the black queen takes it, then the queen and rook are attacking the queen that's just captured the bishop. So the white queen, is in a way X-raying the black queen and having an influence over the bishop on f6. So the two moves that are playable really are king takes f6, and now the black queen is being pinned. So what we can do is step aside with our queen, and now black is losing the queen for a rook. White should win this fairly easily. So the other move is bishop takes f6, which does lead to more complications. But again, there's this idea of X-raying the f6 bishop, and that comes into full effect with knight g4. So the threat is knight takes f6, and then if the king takes, the black queen will be pinned again. So there's several moves. One is queen takes queen, then rook takes, and we're pinning the bishop, attacking it with two pieces, and black can't defend it anymore. So black will lose the bishop for nothing. The other move is moving the bishop out the way, but now we step aside with our queen again, and the black queen is being lost in exchange for a rook. So the final move, which takes full advantage of this X-ray, is stepping aside with our king, and now knight takes f6 wins the bishop, because black cannot capture with either piece, because it will lose even more material. Again, if the queen takes it, white has queen takes f6 check, and I'm pretty sure there'll be a checkmate in a few moves. And if the king takes it, then we can step aside with our queen again. So the best move may be for black to exchange queens, and we still are a piece up. White's winning by a knight, and that should easily be enough to win the game, for example, from this position. So it was a very interesting opening from Alekhine in this game. It did go a bit off the beaten track with the move bishop g5, which has been seen, but it's not a common sight. And while black goes about setting up the ideal structure in the King's Indian, white is trying a rather unusual setup, with e3 and c3 being played, but having the bishop on c4, so it's targeting the f7 pawn and the black king. So I feel that while Alekhine had an interesting idea of having all his pieces going for the enemy king with the move knight h2, what black should really catch on to here is preventing white's idea. The idea is obviously to play f4. It's the only move where knight h2 makes any sense. So you need to immediately stop that idea, which Alekhine's opponent did not effectively do here. I think this was the pivotal moment. After queen c8, white's move is good. f4, and now his pawns are menacing. But my move, e5, f4 can still be played, but it could be very dangerous for white. So if we play the move f4, trying to continue with the idea, then one continuation I can see is pawn takes pawn, c takes, and knight takes is an option, which would lead to a very messy position. And well, let's take a look at that briefly. Knight takes, pawn takes, rook e8, knight e4, and then either rook takes or knight takes look interesting. So rook takes, queen takes, knight takes, bishop takes, and white's the exchange up, but has quite a weak pawn structure here. But the very interesting move would be, I think, moving the queen out the way to b8, let's say. And it looks like white's position is starting to fall apart. If white takes the knight with check, his queen will be pinned. But even if he castles, the knight on e4 is not adequately protected. So I think bishop d3, but then perhaps a move like d5, and it looks like white's position has completely fallen apart here. Knight takes check. Whoops. Well, we could do bishop takes, actually. Bishop takes, pawn takes, and then two white pieces are en prise at the same time. So if if white does bishop takes g7, black has pawn takes bishop, and the queen is still pinned. And then it's a very simple win for black here. So again, I didn't have to be a grandmaster or anything to see this. It just looks like a plan that's much too slow if black can appreciate white's ideas and counteract them. So a Nimzovich quote that I'll leave you with is, or a paraphrase, is if one side is trying to attack on the wing, like white's doing here, attacking on the king side with f4, counter it in the center. And my move of e5 does exactly that. Black is now opening up the center to attack the still uncastled black king and take advantage of its position. So I hope you got something from this video. Comment, like, subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye.